Hello, everyone. This is the last time you will have to look at me, at least for chapter 7. Okay? We're going to talk a little bit more. I wanted to complete what I had to say, or what I should say, about aggregate supply. Now, remember that aggregate demand is the relationship between the price level and the level of real GDP that people will purchase and consume. Uh, Aggregate supply, on the other hand, is the relationship between price levels and real GDP that firms, the people that make stuff, will make. Okay? And we talked about, before we were so rudely interrupted by the end of the recording, we talked about aggregate supply being in basically two time frames: short run and long run. And we talked about the difference between them. Obviously, long run is longer than short run. If you answer that answer and about $6 will get you a tall latte at Starbucks. But anyway, there's more to it than that. In the long run, any situation that occurs in the economy, firms are able to completely react to it and keep it. If the economy is hitting on all cylinders, like it is here in long run aggregate supply, if anything would knock it off, there would be time enough to quickly get back to long run equilibrium. And this equilibrium implies sense. Notice it is a straight line, so it is not influenced at all by price levels. Okay? If aggregate demand increased or decreased at the long run ideal equilibrium, you might say, it would just affect the price levels. Okay? But now short run, on the other hand, we said, is a shorter run of time that does not allow the economy to fully react and compensate for changes in economic conditions, mainly because of what are called sticky prices. And those are prices that once they're kind of ensconced in the economy, they don't change right away. Okay? Chief among those are wages. In many of the industrial countries, and in our country to a great extent, there are collective bargaining agreements and wages that won't drop because of changing economic conditions. Or say if the company loses an order, or a big order or something like that, they will lay off people, but they won't lower the wages. Okay? So, this short run aggregate supply curve is more like the supply curve in the micro sense. Okay? It doesn't exactly relate. It doesn't have enough time to react to changing economic conditions. So, think of long-run aggregate supply as running on full cylinders, and it's the ideal output of the economy when everybody has their act together. The long-run aggregate supply implies that there's no unemployment, or I should say there is the natural rate of employment. Very little unemployment, maybe 4 to 5% of frictional unemployment. And this is the ideal. But the short run aggregate supply and the aggregate demand actually state what the economy is doing right now. Okay? What it's actually doing. So in the way we have diagrammed this, we have seen here that something caused aggregate demand, maybe cut in government spending or cut in consumer confidence or something like that. So aggregate demand decreased, okay? So it was on the output level that was running on full cylinders, but when it decreased, it came to a new short-term equilibrium or current equilibrium at a GDP level below ideal. And so we call this a recessionary gap. Okay? Recessionary gap. Now, if for some reason, and in a recessionary gap, excuse me, the average price levels are too low, the price level is too low, should be up there, and the GDP output is too low. Okay. Now, on the other hand, if aggregate demand, say, okay, let's get this guy out of the way. Let's say aggregate demand and aggregate supply, or short-run aggregate supply, are on the ideal level here, okay? Well, you know that the economy is dynamic and changing all the time. And when everything's running on full cylinders, something happens to increase aggregate demand. And aggregate demand, say, moves out. Where'd my blue marker go? Here it is. Good check of time. Let's say the aggregate demand will move out to here. Okay? That's AD1, and let's say that's AD2. Well, notice what happens here. The current equilibrium is more than the ideal capacity of the economy. It's more. In this situation, look, the price level is too high. The equilibrium price level is too high. And the equilibrium, try saying that fast 5 times. The equilibrium output level is beyond the capacity for the economy to sustain. In essence, the economy is running too hot, and it's causing prices to go up. So, strangely enough, if to the low side is a recessionary gap, the gap to the high side is an inflationary gap. Okay? Inflationary gap. With an inflationary gap, the price level is too high, and the economy is running too hot, and that's what happens when there's too much buying for the capacity to make. Prices go way up. So now what is done to handle situations like this? Well, one thing the government does very well, in fact, it's their expertise, is to do nothing and allow the market forces basically to drop wages eventually and prices, nominal wages and prices, and bring aggregate demand. Aggregate demand will move down this way. Okay. Or what they can do, and that takes a long time. Okay. Or what they can do is implement a monetary policy, which we'll talk about. I don't want it to be a monster. Monetary policy, or manipulate the money supply and interest rates so that aggregate demand will move down, hopefully to this, near to this point. Or they can do a fiscal policy. And fiscal policy involves government spending. And each of these things affects the components of aggregate demand, or GDP, which is consumption plus net investment plus government plus net exports. So what they do in this case, this would be called, these things, to get aggregate demand down, is called a contractionary policy. And we'll learn more about that in upcoming chapters. Now, if aggregate demand is down here, and there is a recessionary gap, price levels are too low, the economy needs to be jump-started or kicked up a little bit, they can, again, do nothing, but it takes a long time for it to correct, and it corrects in very slow geological time frames. Or they can do monetary policy, kick up the money supply, lower interest rates. Or they can do a fiscal policy, which will affect the G component of this, and increase aggregate demand up to this point. Again, remember, the gaps are gaps of GDP from the ideal level. Okay? A gap on the high side is an inflationary gap. Look what it does. Change the equilibriums there and see what it does to the prices. Okay, a gap on the low side is a recessionary gap. And let me know if you have any questions, and we will go from here. Thank you.